Let's move into the topics for this particular month. We have Bob Krone and Dylan Edwards, and I think, Bob, are you on?
I sure am.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for joining. I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself and move right into the presentation. Everyone enjoy.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everybody, and we are going to start doing some introduction to Microsoft Endpoint Manager. I've looked back in time over some of the previous user group events, and I've noticed there's been a lot of topics that have occurred over time, and Endpoint Manager, especially modern day, is becoming really important. And I've also seen a lot of analytics and a lot of information that many organizations are either considering or are in the process or already moved to products like Endpoint Manager. But I've also learned that a lot of people don't know what they don't know about Endpoint Manager. So this might be a start. We'll see. There might be more coming down the road that I'll do that'll dig into certain areas about Endpoint Manager, but you'll very much be helpful in deciding about, well, what are you also interested in after this? So my background, I've been in IT for 20 plus years. I've also been an instructor, so I'm with New Horizons of Minnesota. I teach Endpoint Manager, Azure Active Directory, Azure Services, and a number of other things. But what we're going to do is we kind of need to do the end at the beginning, because what I'd like to do is actually kick off what's called an autopilot. But we need to make sure we understand what autopilot is before we kick that off. So I'm going to actually jump to that portion about autopilot in Endpoint Manager, because this is going to take up most of the time of this delivery for this to occur. So Endpoint Manager is a cloud managed solution, and one of its options is autopilot, and its abilities to work with Windows 10, 11, primarily aspect with mobile device managed enrolled devices. So it really is about controlling the out-of-the-box experience, in addition to after it completes the autopilot reset. So the goal is zero touchability. So that mobile device, as long as there's internet connectivity and on the other end we can communicate to the agent, we'll be able to tell that device to do a number of things, including, well, let's go ahead and reset you. Well, that goal as part of controlling that is to also make sure that the device is going to be maintained in Azure Active Directory and Endpoint Manager. Now, we'll come back to the rest of this in a little bit, but what I have here.
Hey, Bob.
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you sharing, or is there slides you wanted to share?
I thought I had shared. Let's do that again. Sure, and I will post my slides.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. So I'm going to post slides in just a minute because I really do want to make sure I can get this autopilot going. So just to kind of give you the lay of the land, this is a Windows 10 device that is mobile device managed. So just to kind of highlight it, I'm going to go inside of the Windows settings accounts area. And when we look in this area for access worker school, we see that this device is connected to Azure Active Directory, and there is this info button. And what we see here are a number of policies. So for those of you that are new to endpoint management, policies, if you're familiar with on-premise group policies, think along that line. ways that we can control this device. So this is a mobile device management. Some applications are deployed and some aren't, and I'll cover that in a little bit. And sync. So kind of like doing a GP update or a GP update force, we can force the device to check in with Endpoint Manager. Well, we take a look at this device and we're going to kind of follow a digital DNA of it. So this is client 1-10. Now, I'm going to start off in Azure Active Directory, and I'm going to find the user Adele. So Azure AD is a big piece of this, as we'll see in a minute, but Adele has some devices. And she has 2 of the ones that I have that I'm going to be working with. Client 1, which is Windows 10, and Client 3, which is Windows 11, plus some other ones. And as we can see here, some are joined, some are registered, and some are even enrolled in mobile device management. We also can see some of the devices are iOS oriented. Well, I'm going to go, and one of the things that we see here is this purple icon. And that's an indicator in Azure AD that this is enrolled in autopilot in Endpoint Manager. So I'm just going to follow this digital DNA trail. And we can see this from an Azure AD perspective. But when I go under Manage, this is looking at it actually in Endpoint Manager. Now, if I go into Endpoint Manager, and people could have different roles, different access. Some people can see things through Azure AD, some people will manage through this. Well, same thing. If I look through users, or even more appropriately, devices. So I'm going to look at Windows devices, and I'm going to find that device. Now, some of you may ask, why isn't it purple in here? Well, it's actually an Azure AD functionality. But in here, when I select it, I'm going to get that similar view. I have it like Endpoint Manager. Now, to speed this up along this top bar, we have a number of choices. Some of it comes with being mobile device managed, some mobile application, but some of them are specific to things such as being in autopilot. So what I'm about to do is this device is going to be remotely told that it's supposed to go through a reset. Well, license-wise, as we'll discover, the user needs to have an Intune license. And the device is also, as we saw, affiliated or associated with Adele. Now, I'm doing this as an Endpoint Manager, and I'm going to kick off the autopilot. So one of the main aspects is autopilot. The goal is remove files, apps, and settings and reset the device. And we'll learn a little bit more about that. But I'm going to kick this off. So to speed this up, I'm going to go to that Windows 10 device, and I am going to ask this to actually go check in to speed up the process, because this could take 45 minutes or more just for it to background check and to go in and actually be told, hey, you're going to go through an AP reset, autopilot reset. So we see now, it just came down, you're about to be signed out, your system administrator needs to restart for autopilot, and it's scheduled for 45 minutes. I'm going to wait just a couple minutes, but I'm also, for time purposes, also going to kick one off on this other device. So between the two of them, we'll see some of the things that are happening. Now, this device is Windows 11. Some of you might not be familiar with it, but the setup of the Windows settings is just a little different. So I'm going to go under Accounts, and I'm going to go down to Access Worker School. And it's just listed a little differently. But what I'm going to do is also force a sync and let that speed up. All right. Now, enough time has gone by that I'm going to be able to cause this. And we can see back here on the Windows 11, we see that it also is being told that it's about to go through an AP reset. Now, autopilot reset, just to make sure you're familiar with it, is actually tapping into a built-in ability of Windows. It's tapping into, when I go under Windows Settings, Update and Security, Recovery is the reset. Now, this has been around since Windows 10, actually back to the Windows 8 days, but it gives us the ability, if you were to choose this, keep my files or remove everything, that's a built-in Windows ability. But what autopilot does is it helps control, well, we do a reset first and then the actual OS install, which autopilot is going to help control our out-of-the-box experience. And we'll see that in a little bit. So any questions, anybody? Okay.
No
So,
questions in the chat.
All right, thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get this going because this is going to run in the background. We'll just check in on it periodically. We're going to see here in a moment that this is about to tell us that it's processing this. So we see that it is started for client 1 doing the client reset. Now, I'm also going to cause the Windows 11 device to also go. Well, as you can see here, this one, well, it was told to do it, but it failed. And there could be a number of reasons. Something could be interfering with it, but we could have an option that we can configure this device that I want somebody to do a local autopilot reset. Somebody who has local administrator permissions. Now, if we take a look at the Windows 11, we see that this one is actually going through the process without any issues. It is going through and it's doing the reset phase. So what I'm going to do is I am going to use an account that has administrative permissions to be able to kick off this autopilot reset. Now, this device pretty much could be anywhere on the planet. As long as it has internet connectivity, we have the potential that as long as you have an internet connection back to the endpoint manager, we'll be able to kick this off. Now, as we continue, I'll refer back to these, but I want to get going and start sharing some files and such.
There is a question in the chat asking if this is the same tool that AP uses on Surface Hub and HoloLens.
Correct. Yes, it can be used with HoloLens and certain aspects of some devices, of Surface devices. All right, let me attach the file. For some reason, I'm not able to attach the file.
You could probably send them out to the user group board or personally to me, and I can make sure that they get shared.
I will take care of that then. Okay. All right, here we go. We're gonna kind of rewind and start back at the beginning. So we just saw, well, the end in mind of part of this is that autopilot. So now we're going to get into Endpoint Manager. I know slide presentations aren't supposed to have like paper, but there's so many moving parts to this. So I'm just going to highlight some of this. You'll have access to the slides. One of the things to keep in mind is many businesses have Active Directory service. One thing that it comes with is mobile device management. It uses things like group policies to manage the device, the users on it, applications, security settings, and so on. That's built into Active Directory. Now, we also on-premise optionally could use a paid product, Endpoint Configuration Manager, formerly System Center Config Manager, or other third party. So when we start talking about Endpoint Manager, we can't really talk about it without Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory is the primary identity service provider for a tenant, and that could be things such as Azure services, Microsoft 365, Dynamics, of course, Endpoint Manager, the Power Suite, and other things. And Cloud First, those two devices that I just reset were Cloud First. Those devices were actually only joined to Azure AD and enrolled in Endpoint Manager. No Active Directory. Other devices could be possibly in a hybrid aspect. During their setup, they could be told, you're going to also be part of Active Directory on-prem, as well as Azure Active Directory. And we also want you to be enrolled in Endpoint Manager. So laying the groundwork for some terminology, mobile device management is kind of like Kleenex. That's a general term, but it actually does have meaning when compared to mobile application management. Mobile device management is primarily intended for a company or corporately managed device that is joined into, example, Active Directory, or in our case, Azure Active Directory, not just AD. But it also, we have the ability with Endpoint Manager to do application management. Now, the main difference between these, device managed is just like on-premise. If a device is joined to Active Directory, a user can sign in with a user profile to Active Directory as an example. Well, in our case, Cloud First, a user on a joined device to Azure AD will have an Azure AD profile that they could sign in with. Now, mobile application management, it's not joined, it's registered. And that's often for BYOD, bring your own device, so a private device, or our corporate type devices that really aren't meant to be joined. We just want to do some levels of management on them, but not quite fully. So with Endpoint Manager, can do a lot of things. Now, as I mentioned, Endpoint Manager, actually, you can't really talk about it safely without Azure AD. Our identities come from Azure AD by default. Now, they could be synchronized. We'll get to that in a little bit. But one of the important aspects is no Endpoint Manager without a user being assigned an Intune license. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But a big piece with this whole cloud access, anytime, anywhere access is, well, security. The one thing the third bullet here, conditional access policies, are conditional access policies really aren't an option if we have endpoint management needs. And what we're focusing on is Azure Premium licensing. Now, Endpoint Manager gives us the ability, as we can see on the main bullets up here, help us do, Microsoft has zero trust abilities. The abilities to help protect your devices, your users, your applications, services, and more, and use conditions to make sure that conditions are met before accessing resources by an identity and or a device. Now, Endpoint Manager, as we've already talked about, gives us the ability to manage devices, operating systems, and applications. So that's very much like Active Directory with things like group policies, as well as endpoint security. We can also deploy though. So that's where kind of group policies goes away. Group policies doesn't really deploy an operating system. We could use Endpoint Config Manager on-prem or other third parties. But we can deploy operating systems, application security settings, policies, as well as OS and application updates. We can also secure data on mobile device managed, corporately managed, as well as mobile application managed devices, with or without the device being enrolled in Endpoint Manager. Now, devices could be assigned. The devices that I just went through, AP reset, autopilot reset, were actually assigned to a user, so 1-to-1 ratio. Some are more like a kiosk. You might have a single-use device intended by use by a lot of different people. Well, some of the main differences are that 1-to-1 assignment can ensure that that user on their device gets certain settings, configurations, applications, and more, where when we're on a shared device like a kiosk, it's really about the device, not so much the user. Now, we already talked about an Intune license, but again, conditional access policy. And as we're going to see kind of a blowout of a conditional access policy, it requires an Azure AD Premium 1 or Premium 2. Now, it's not just Windows that we can manage. We can also manage mobile devices such as Android, Apple, so iOS and iPad, as well as Mac, Windows, and even Microsoft's Windows 365 or Azure Virtual Desktops environments as well. And of course, applications and endpoint security on those devices. So, licensing. Some of you, and this is part of the reason I really wanted to start with this, is I've been talking with a lot of customers and students, etc. I'm finding a lot of organizations have licenses, they're not even tapping into them, such as you might have Business Premium. That includes Intune as well as Azure AD Premium Level 1. If you have 365, F1 or F3, as well as E3, E5s, well, what you get varies. So when we're dealing with our frontline workers, it includes Intune and Premium 1, but then we get into the 365 E3, E5 or government equivalent. You get not just Intune, Azure AD Premium, but those also come with operating system licensing, so subscription licensing. And the breakdown is E3 licenses will give you Premium 1, E5s will give you Premium 2, and we also may have another packaged offering that you may have is enterprise mobility and security. And that comes either E3 or E5. And when you get the slides, these all have links to information about what those various products have. Well, I'm going to actually jump forward. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And I'm going to pause because I just want to at least let you see where we're at on these resets. So remember, there's two main phases right now. This is the reset phase. So as soon as it gets close to 100%, it's going to restart, and then it's going to actually, well, the familiar operating system setup phase. So reset, and then the operating system. All right, let's get back.
There's a question in the chat. Are there any tips on how to implement different config policies or profiles for different groups? GPOs can be layered and ordered, but Intune seems to show conflicts if settings overlap, which would make for a bit of a management nightmare for anything beyond basic config. So anything you can help with on config profiles for different groups?
Absolutely, Ryan, that's a really good question. Ryan, if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of defer that for a minute because we're going to do kind of a quick drive-by of some areas, just kind of laying out the paperwork per se. But the answer is how you architect, plan, and manage group policies. Very similar here when you're going to want to manage the various device or user configuration profiles, or when you're doing compliance policies or other things. So I'll point out a few of those. But yes, when you get into that conflict, it's a good amount of architect planning and designing can mitigate or eliminate. But it gets back into, if you do the same setting in too many areas, conflicts will occur. So ideally, try to have common settings and then breakouts from there as needed. But we'll take a look at that shortly. Great question, huge question. Premium licensing. The one thing I want to emphasize with Azure AD Premium, just highlights, is Premium Level 1 is the bare minimum if you want to do things like conditional access policies. But it's also a big one for things like dynamic groups. If you're not familiar with dynamic groups, it makes managing users as well as devices so much easier because we can look at the properties of a user object and respectfully a device object. Now, Premium 2 gives some advanced options such as privileged identity management, but related is, of course, in addition to what's in P1, we also get identity protection. And when we take a look at a conditional access policy in a little bit, user risk at sign-in or just general user risk comes with Premium 2. Conditional access policies can check for that before we ever get access. So, conditional access policies. Why are they important? Well, I hate to say it, if you're using cloud-based administration, giving access through Azure Active Directory, well, you may be saying, why would I be doing that? I like to point out, and I'm going to purposely go out to Azure Active Directory. And when we talk about granting access, of course, we commonly think about our users. And of course, things like Adele and her devices. Now, when we're granting access, you're dealing with authentication and then authorization. And during the authorization, we have the ability to do conditional access. Well, just a quick drive-by. When we talk about dynamic groups, it's very much a big deal to have dynamic groups when you're wanting to do things like mobile device management. So we can see that there are a series of them here that are in fact dynamic. And when we take a look at this, I'm just picking the group. You don't add or remove members. Members are determined by dynamic membership rules. Now, this is for devices, and there are many different kinds of properties that we can tap into. So one of those aspects of the question that was asked is, how can you make things more targeted? Dynamic groups can really assist you when you're wanting to do given actions. And just by nature of meeting these rules, that device will automatically be added as a member. So we also have the ability to deal with users as well. And users also are an important attribute. So when I take a look at users and their membership rules, you can have quite a few expressions in here. Equals, contains, what are those specific requirements for a user to have dynamic membership? So again, that comes with premium. Well, this keeps leading towards what's called conditional access policies. When we take a look at conditional access policies, we're going to be connecting some dots. What does this have to do with Endpoint Manager? We're getting there. In conditional access, so I'm under the security, the tenant security conditional access, and we can have policies. Now remember, premium P1 or P2 requirements for these. And when we look at these, something as simple as require multi-factor authentication. Now here's the highlights. Users, what apps, conditions, and then what is the type of granting access or blocking and possible session. So if I go back to the slides, what we see here now is a blowout of this. And I'm going to kind of zoom in to make it a little easier. And again, you're going to have a copy of this. Users and groups in this example, we want to, well, include the phrase end in mind. Down here, what's the ultimate goal? To grant or block access. So any of the include is part of this grant access. So if a user has this membership, and as long as they are not a guest or external, we move to the next and we deal with what's called cloud apps and actions. Now, one of the things we see here, enterprise apps. So granting access to our various applications and services, such as Exchange or SharePoint, but even possibly third-party software as a service products. Get into the aspects of doing that. Well, we're now going to come down to the whole conditions area, and this is where Endpoint Manager starts coming into play. So with conditions, we have more breakouts. Conditional access policies are very, very powerful. User risk level. We have the ability, we could tap into that Azure P2 user risk or sign-in risk. So example, if a user, hey, we're here in the Twin Cities, but a user's account is all of a sudden being signed in from somewhere in Europe, and then shortly after it's going to be signed in from South America, boom, we could lock the account automatically and assign a tier level of that account so that they cannot gain access. We also have platform. So when we take a look at our platform aspect, many different platforms, and recently added is even Linux. And we don't have full Linux abilities, but we can detect it. But we can even say, I don't want to allow access from certain operating systems. But then location. And this is the big thing. Many businesses are small, medium, and they may be in a few locations. And then you get into the global audience. Some organizations are spread out all over the world or a region. We can tap into and define allowed locations by name, such as country, as well as IP addresses, and even group together countries and other IPs that we may not want to allow access. So now we start tapping into and get into some options about the grant access. See, when we decide we want to grant access, yep, require multi-factor, very common. But now here's where Endpoint Manager comes into play. Require device to be marked as compliant requires Intune by default. We're dealing with Endpoint Manager and the ability that we can set up our compliance policies that will dictate what is a device's compliance requirements. And as long as it meets a certain compliance requirement, that could be a factor of granting access. But there's more. We also can see things such as require hybrid joint, Azure Active Directory, but then approve client apps and require app protection policy. Protection policies come from Endpoint Manager. And in this case, the grant access says require all of those selected. So this is where conditional access and Endpoint Manager really kind of work together. Very powerful ways. And this is just scratching the surface of it. So Endpoint Manager is great, but having user accounts or devices coming in from anytime, anywhere is not always great. So let me check the chat really quick, see if there are any questions. Okay, I don't see any. So let's check in. So we can see now that the devices, we can see that this client 1 is actually in the install phase. So it's done with the reset phase and it's going through the install phase now. Now, these two devices, this client 10 and the Windows 11, they're not necessarily identical, as in hardware and other things. So as we get ready to see, we'll come back to here, back to these in just a moment. I want to make sure to continue on with our presentation. So we've seen now some of the moving parts that are Azure AD oriented, directly related. Let's take a look in Endpoint Manager. Endpoint Manager, when we are going to use it, it's for managing devices, applications, and endpoint security. That's the main buckets of what we choose. So devices, again, multiple platforms, Windows, iOS, iPad, Mac, and Android. We have the abilities to manage mobile device and or mobile application management. When we deal with apps, same aspect. We could have Windows apps, iOS, iPad, Mac, and Android. And endpoint security, antivirus, disk encryption, operating system, device compliance, and more. So when we take a look at devices, I'm going to focus on Windows for right now. And we can see several buckets here under Windows policies. Compliance policies, and like we saw with our conditional access, device must be compliant. So if a device meets a given compliance policy, yes.
I'm on a.
Oh, I see. One thing that gets confusing about CA policies, exclude and grant block. Block Linux clients exactly the same as Grant? Not quite. I'd be glad to have a side discussion because that is pretty new, but it is not exactly the same with a Block or Grant. It really does depend. It's just getting out of preview recently. Yeah, report only is always helpful. It is very helpful. Now, when we take a look at our policies, these compliance policies, unfortunately, many people think group policies equals compliance policy. No, compliance policies are not group policies. We'll get to our group policy equivalents in a moment. Here, we can set up that whatever devices fall under this could have requirements to do things such as BitLocker, secure boot, require password. We could require that there be a TPM module, a firewall. It doesn't have to be Microsoft's Defender. It just has to be identified and registered, a third-party one. So we have a number of things, and we can control, well, if a device is marked non-compliant, there's a grace period by default. You can set up periods of time, but eventually we don't want to allow a device access, such as if it's been offline for a long time. If it's gone offline for a long time, it may not have Windows updates. It may not have antivirus update definitions or an engine. So we can identify a target group and newer abilities, including filtering for specific properties within the group. Much like we saw with our dynamic groups, we have the ability to look at properties, same concept there. Now, when we get back to devices, now we were looking at compliance, configuration profiles. This is what's very similar to what we think of for those who are familiar with group policies. And these that you see, I'm just going to kind of sort. These that say admin template, these are the online version. They're pieces that have been broken off of some of the security settings of group policies, such as health monitoring, Wi-Fi settings, certificates, identity. Some of these also only exist here in Endpoint Manager. They don't exist inside of group policies. But setting up these as an example, I want to make sure we see example certificates tied and associated to a store, or I want to manage hello or hello for business. I want to manage down here with our administrative templates. And what we see here is analytics, device status, per user status, or even per setting status possibilities. When we look at the properties of this, like group policies, we can push down a lot of settings. Silently sign in the user to OneDrive. Enable search suggestion or control that. Nope, we do not want the reward experience. I mean, a lot of things are built in, including now Google Chrome, as well as the Microsoft 365 desktop suite. So managing desktop versions of Outlook, Word, Excel, Teams, and so on as well. But that's your configuration profiles. We can even push down scripts like PowerShell scripts. We can have scripts running under the context of an elevated administrator or under the user's context if we want to. Now, it isn't just about Windows. We can also, if I go back to devices, we also have the ability, it's also possibly like iOS. We can have compliance policies. And I want to take a moment because remember, Windows devices, iOS, etc., one of the important takeaways is that mobile device managed versus mobile application managed. Right now, there's a third device here. This CL4 is a personal device. It's a Dell's home computer. And when we look at it and take a look under the hood of its settings and under its accounts, what we see here under the Access Worker School, this is not full device managed. There is no direct ability to sign in. It is this person's personal device. They're signed in with a local account or maybe their Microsoft account. In this case, this person has a Microsoft account and their device is registered with their Microsoft account. But in order to gain access, we can push down requirements, even on a Windows device, same, similar, not identical, but iOS and Mac, as well as Android devices. Compliance policies, configuration profiles. I want to be able to manage that. Set up my compliance. I'm not sure why it didn't refresh a little bit, but we can see what is compliance on the iOS device. Don't allow jailbroke, require a password. And you may say, well, aren't those device management? In order to protect our data and access to our data and resources, we can set minimum requirements reflecting on the device. We can't push down the change, but we can require. And that's the goal of a compliance. Compliance doesn't make changes. It just says this is what is required to be in compliance. But we can use things such as configuration profiles across these various platforms to push out settings on device managed. Application managed, you're limited. Now, I want to, for time, because we've got about 15 minutes, I want to make sure you can see, well, what we're looking at is these devices are managed. And we're seeing the differences between Windows 10 and 11, that automatically the devices joining, registering, and preparing it, in this case for device. And now the device is going through setups. So we can see what's happening in the background. And one of the important things, depending on what is set up for these devices, remember, dynamic groups are fantastic. What's going to take some time and we may not get there? Apps. There could be a whole lot of different kinds of apps that are meant to be installed per device. But there's also the possibility that applications could be assigned per user. So we're going to leave right now, and I'm going to go under apps really quick. So when we look at apps, I'm going to look at all apps. These aren't here by default. Some of these are endpoint managed upload, like this 7-zip is an MSI file posted here. Some of these we can see are from the iOS store, some are from the Microsoft store, and some are from the store for business, meaning our company has specific apps that we want possibly to even be automatically assigned or installed per device or per user. We can also push out things such as links, web links. We can even push out and repackage some legacy 32-bit apps if we wanted to. So there's a lot of different kinds of apps, and depending on how these various apps are set up or configured, taking a look at this 7-zip, just as a small example, this particular application is under a device context if it's installed. And what we see down below, a lot of groups, we really notice assignments means automatically install at a device level. And yes, we even might advertise to users. And yes, we can even push down apps on a mobile application or a personal device if we wanted to. Just needs to be enrolled. But apps, I want to bring back that conditional access policy now. When we were looking at some of the conditions, we know about the device needs to be marked compliant policies. But down here, require app protection policies, Endpoint Manager as well. So when we go take a look inside of our Endpoint Manager apps area, we see in the policy section for the apps, we can also do app protection policies across various platforms. So in order to use an app on a specific platform, we could dictate all aspects that you must use Microsoft's version of Outlook. You must use Microsoft Edge browser. And you're not allowed to save or back up anything into the iCloud. And anything business oriented must be encrypted, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the big app protection policy aspects, is across multiple platforms to meet governance, compliance, or heck, we just want to make sure our stuff is protected. We'll use app protection policies. So to take a look at an example, we see with enrollment and without enrollment. So remember, devices conditional access policies doesn't require, unless the condition says it must be compliant, well, that ends everything. The device must be enrolled. But what happens when somebody walks up to, example, a conference center or a hotel business center and is going to go sign in and check Outlook or go access Teams? That's without enrollment. We can have specific requirements, but we could also make sure, again, conditional access can ensure in combination with endpoint management policies, app device level, compliance policies, that won't happen just as easily. Now, wiping, picture Adele quits. Now, obviously, one of the big concerns is on her personal device, she may have access to company data. Her device is currently registered and enrolled in endpoint management. So she could be gaining access. We can selectively wipe application data. We can tell it, make sure this is not a trusted device, remove access. Tell it not to keep it. Same thing on our corporate devices. We can do application level wiping instead of necessarily the whole device wipe. And especially on Android and iOS, those are really important because people don't want to lose what's on their personal devices just as well. Let's see. So I want to take a quick breather. Questions, anybody? So we're coming down to the final topics, and I just wanted to check. Endpoint Manager, how many of you have been interested or found endpoint management interesting? Anybody currently using it? And even more important, license-wise, are any of you licensed to use it but not using it? Because that, if you don't have any device management, even a small mom and pop shop, Endpoint Manager can really assist, because the size of the business doesn't necessarily dictate governance and compliance and regulatory requirements. The smallest of businesses, some businesses here in the Twin Cities work with Department of Defense. It's not the size of the business, it's what they do and who they work with. You're using it, interesting, not your specialty, in the early stages, project setting it up for both. Okay, Brian. Company is, but not current team. Great info. We have licenses, but not using it. All right. Well, I appreciate you all sharing. Yeah, we're at this kind of phase that Endpoint Manager has matured. And very importantly, one of the big aspects of it is, as I'm keeping everything neutral. I just had a conversation with a customer about a week ago, and they said their plans are to completely migrate their mobile devices off of Endpoint Config Manager and do everything via Endpoint Manager. And they're a worldwide organization. And then there are others, I like my Config Manager, which is fine, but that can also integrate. We can integrate Config Manager with our Endpoint Manager. Config Manager can send commands. Now, I apologize. I was hoping the apps were going to be there, but I want to make sure to get back to several things and touch base that autopilot right now. In the background, there's a section in autopilot that helps us control that out-of-the-box experience. The language setup, keyboard, privacy settings, Cortana, hello, and more. We can pick and choose what we want to have happen. And again, the goal is the device is maintained in Azure AD and Endpoint Manager. So the key word is device management. This is not possible for a registered device, but even more powerful. If you're working with a device vendor, it is possible that they can provide you what are known as hardware signatures for your devices, such as Windows devices. Remember, autopilot is a Windows technology. They, option one, could provide you a spreadsheet of hardware signatures for all of your purchases, and you can upload those before they even arrive on your dock or on the front door. The other option is some larger organizations or managed aspects. The device vendor, your OEM or reseller, might actually have access to your Azure AD tenant. They may be able to actually directly add in those hardware signatures into autopilot as well, saving you the hassle. So we've taken a look at almost all areas. I just wasn't able to get to endpoint security for much, length of time, as well as reports. But as we get ready to wrap this up, just always keep in mind there are many different moving parts. Azure Active Directory, you have your user, your device, groups, possibly dynamic groups, possibly conditional access. We're dealing with the device being joined or registered, and that affects if it's also enrolled in Endpoint Manage. Is it a corporate device or is it a personal device? Are we dealing with device management, application management? Endpoint Manager, depending on licensing and your wants and needs, can be a very powerful tool to assist you with managing known devices, unknown devices, gaining access to corporate information, data, and much more. Well, I want to thank all of you. I'm going to just let these continue. And I will send some screenshots as part of the end of the slides, just so you all can see. So I want to thank you very much for attending this. And if you have topics of interest within Endpoint Configuration Manager, feel free, share those, and be glad to see if there's more interest on this for future deliveries.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Bob. This is really thorough and really great information. Feel free to send your slide deck to me. I'll make sure we get it up on our website along with this recording as well. Does anyone have any other questions for Bob while he's on? All right, well, if there's any, I can make sure to route them over, and thank you again, Bob.
Yep, and just, I'm sorry, just take this 30 seconds. I wanted to make sure everybody could see it says success, Windows is set up and ready to go. And then the person could go sign in and we'll be able to continue possibly with user application and other setups. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Always nice to see the success. Awesome. All right, well, let's go ahead and move into our next topic. Dylan, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful. Well, I can go ahead and turn it over to you for your Power Platform story.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll start off by, I guess, asking if anybody needs a shakeout break, stand up, move around, get the blood flow into their legs again. So my name is Dylan Edwards, and I work for Stearns County. I've been with Stearns County for about 9 years, a little over 9 years now. And we're located, our county seat is St. Cloud, for those of you that we're not sure where we're located. And so my title is project manager, but I do a lot of Power Apps development as well. My background is in web development. I actually teach as an adjunct instructor for both St. Cloud Technical and Community College, as well as South Central College in North Mankato, teaching PHP, MySQL, and JavaScript and things like that. So that's kind of what my background is and how I ended up working on these things. And as much as I do love to get into the code when I'm developing applications and things, I've really found the Power Platform, Power Apps specifically, to be just a great tool to use for developing quick internal applications. And I don't have a slide deck put together. I'm going to jump into some live demos here quickly, but I did want to just kind of quickly talk about, I'm not sure what level everyone here is at on the Power Platform. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So within Power Apps, there are two very different types of applications. There are what are called Canvas apps, which look more like this. As a developer, I have full control about where I drag and drop these controls, the colors, font sizes, and all that are being used here. And then there are model-driven apps, which looks more like those of you that are familiar with Dynamics, Microsoft Dynamics. This is a little bit more structured, less flexibility with where things are positioned. You know, I think we can toggle whether the label on this form field is to the left or to the right. And just for the other government folks here, this is pretty much for all of these demos that I'll be showing, this is our development environment. So we won't be coming across any sensitive data in here. Any questions before we get started?
None in the chat, but we'll definitely let you know when something comes up.
Perfect. One thing I want to mention too early on is that these Power Apps, these model and Canvas driven apps both, are actually internal only. That I think is one of the big sort of deflation moments when you're learning about these power apps, is how much fun it would be to build something like this and get it into the hands of our external customers. For us, that's the residents of the county. Unfortunately, these tools are internal only. I will be talking about Power Apps Portal a little bit, and that allows external access outside of our tenant, but it's not quite the same level of flexibility as we have with these Canvas apps now. I also wanted to cover a little bit of the difference between Dynamics and Dataverse. So those of you that are familiar with Microsoft Dynamics, that really is a preset bundle of features. So if we go and look at Microsoft Dynamics 365 pricing, we can see that they have these different kind of pre-built off-the-shelf applications. And these are really this sort of model-driven application, but they're built specifically for sales, or they're built for service, which is like, help desk ticketing or queue tracking and things like that. They have marketing, commerce, HR, finance, project management, so on and so forth. And you can see that these are some hot, high ticket items. And while Stearns County does have Dynamics, we are using that in some of our land groups, where I think we're using more of the customer data platform, which is more where we're doing homegrown things, but I think we're using a few of the out-of-the-box entities or tables. But for the most part, it's been custom development. And where my experience has really come from has been working with our human services department on helping to deliver services to their clients and manage things internally that way. So that's a lot of my examples here. So Dynamics sort of pre-built, the database tables are sort of already set and created for these things, whereas the Power Platform and Dataverse, you have to kind of make that up yourself. And I can show some of that as well. All right, just consulting my notes down here. So in general, I think the gist of this presentation is to just talk about how we at Stearns County have utilized mostly Power Apps, and I can show some Power Automate workflow as well, how we have utilized these tools to facilitate our back office work as well as serving our clients. So there may not be a lot of overlap with those of you that are with private companies, but for sure, any fellow city or county organizations that are attending, hopefully some of these use cases will ring true. So the first one that I have up here is a good example of where Power Apps is able to utilize native features of your mobile devices. So I have this app pulled up on my web browser just so that it's easier for you folks to see. But I can also open it up on my phone, which I'm not sure with the background if you'll be able to see that or not. A little bit. So I'm able to pull this up through the Power Apps native application. And the use case for this one is our human services department has these car seats for situations where, unfortunately they have to go and pick up children from not very happy situations. And so they were having trouble. This used to be managed with paper sign out sheet, and the paper gets lost or people erase things or cross things out. And it was just kind of a disaster. So this was one of the first use cases that came to my mind for Power Apps, because we are able to put QR codes or barcodes on the physical car seats themselves. They're actually taped on there with some heavy duty industrial packing tape. And this feature won't work on my computer because it doesn't have access to my computer's camera, but if I click scan on my phone here, it actually turns on. Of course, you're just seeing me through the camera, but you notice there's that green square box there. So it's able to scan the barcode, which will then correspond to one of these car seat IDs. And then the user will be able to check it out. It just opens up another screen, shows a picture of the car seat, basically this same information, and they just click checkout. And then you see these items that are in red here. These are the ones that are currently checked out and to whom they are checked out. And then the expected return date. And then I have a workflow behind the scenes, Power Automate workflow, that will check to see if these things have been, I think it's 2 to 4 days past the return date, that it will start emailing people and escalating, saying, hey, so-and-so has this checked out. It was supposed to be back then. They haven't checked it back in yet. So then that supervisor can kind of run down why that was not turned in. Just a few simple filters here. So even though this is kind of built and designed for a phone, they are able to pull this up on their desktop just like I am, which will allow them to see which car seats are available or not from their desk before they actually take the time to go to where the car seats are stored. And I think this is especially useful for all of our remote work. All of these car seats are sitting in a particular cube, I think on the second or third floor of our admin building downtown. And Human Services has really embraced the remote work. So if they need a car seat, it's very helpful to know that the car seat is available. Now, nothing's stopping two people from, both converging on one car seat at the same time. But I think we're a little bit further ahead than we were with the paper form. So this is the mobile app view. I'm going to show a couple more apps from the sort of app perspective, and then I'll go into that model-driven app and show where the data is for all of these, so I'm not jumping around quite so much. Any questions about car seats? Not seeing any. Thanks, Chris. Glad that's loving this presentation so far. All right, the next one, this again was a paper form. And those of you that work in the human services space will understand this. The back end to the car seat app, a SharePoint list. Actually, it's a Dataverse table. It might be 2 Dataverse tables. I think it's just 1 Dataverse table. I'll show that, but it certainly could be a SharePoint list. If that's if your county is not invested in Dynamics or Power Platform Dataverse yet, SharePoint is absolutely an acceptable way to do this. Some of the benefits of using Dataverse and Dynamics is the native relational functionality of the tables, whereas SharePoint, you can do that, especially you can do it through an app interface like this. So it's definitely possible. I don't know that I have a good example of connecting to a SharePoint list. All right, so this is interpreter claiming when human services is interacting with clients that require an interpreter. Depending on the type of case, that the cost of that interpreter is eligible or not for reimbursement from the state. So again, these were paper forms that people were filling out, and then they would have to interoffice mail or drop them off or take a picture and email it in to our financial workers in human services. And it was taking a lot of time, especially because, and this was surprising for me to find out, but the vast majority of things that they use interpreters for are not reimbursable. So in this case, we have the date that the interpreter was used, the name, this is just free-form text, what language it was. We really only use Spanish and Somali interpreters right now. Then there were some some complex logic behind the scenes with this. So if, and I'm trying to remember what they all were now because it was a while ago that I built this. It was something that if the meeting with the client was less than 8 minutes, then it was not reimbursable. And then starting at 8 minutes, like including the initial 8 minutes, it was charged back in 15-minute intervals. So because this is all sort of custom code and everything, I was able to build that logic in here so that when, let's say they put in that it was only a 5-minute meeting, when this form gets submitted on the back office side, it will get marked as not eligible for reimbursement. It doesn't just delete it. It doesn't go into nowhere. It just goes to a separate place where the financial workers don't necessarily have to view it. And that supposedly has been saving them a lot of time. Also by these different appointment types, and then actually more importantly, the programs is where most of these, I guess, are not reimbursable. I'm trying to remember which one even is. You can pick multiple in case you talk about multiple things. Then this is just open notes. And I think just to build a custom search feature, because you can have a lookup or a drop down for our clients. So we have a big client database for human services. And this then is connected to that. So we could see all interpreter claims connected to Jake Anderson test in the back office system. But this interface for this dropdown is not very user friendly, and it doesn't provide a very good search. So I actually custom built this whole left-hand client search area here. So you can search by their PMI number, Max's case number, Met's case number, first name, last name. If you start typing any of that stuff in here. So if I start typing 864, we'll see Oscar the Grouch came up here. And then there's a difference between the primary client and then the eligible client. So if the main person you're talking to is not eligible for reimbursement for some reason, it's possible that someone else who's a party to that conversation is eligible. So that's why they needed 2 separate places for client information to go. And then initially I didn't have, I think I had the ability to add a new client in here, but I didn't have the ability to edit. And they really wanted to be able to do it all in one place. So I added this edit functionality, which all of these fields are pulling from that client contact database within Dataverse. So that is interpreter claiming app. Again, used to be paper going all over the place, but now it's digital. And I think the big time savings for them was building in the logic of if it's not eligible for reimbursement, let's mark it as that status, and then it will go to sort of a hidden view that's not clogging their task list. So that's interpreter claiming, and you'll see across a lot of the apps that I've built is this data refresh button. And that's because once you open up the Power App, unless you have some sort of timeout or timer behind the scenes going and pulling data from wherever the data source happens to be, somebody could add a new client. That's the one, let's say I had this open yesterday. I think there is a timeout. I'm not sure if it's an hour or a few hours before this page will time out and you have to refresh the whole page. But if somebody adds a client while I've had this app open, they're not going to show up on my list. So before I start to actually fill out this form, I should click that refresh button, or if I can't find the client I'm looking for, I should hit this refresh button. And all this is doing is refreshing the list of clients that are in here. Then obviously I added a restart button in case I need to dump the form I was working on. Yeah, Jessica said you can add a timer at the end of time refresh data source. Yep, absolutely. And I don't think I've actually done that because a lot of the data sources that I'm hitting are pretty big, so I wouldn't want it to unnecessarily have to refresh. That could, at some scalability, put a hit on the system. But so far, these refresh buttons have been working. So that's interpreter claiming. Child placement screening team calendar. So again, this was one that had some unique special requirements. So the child placement screening team is a group of human services supervisors that meet every Wednesday, and they are essentially a panel that reviews child placement cases. So helping to decide a child that can't be in their primary home for whatever reason, where they should end up. And since this is a panel of folks, they only meet on Wednesdays, I think for 2 hours. And they don't want to be sitting there with a gap in their schedule. So again, this one used to be a paper calendar. And, it's great. Our human services folks really care about their clients and things, but I guess there were situations where people would go up to this paper calendar and actually erase somebody else's name and then put their name into a time slot. And there was just all this funny business going on with managing this paper sign-up sheet. Again, that was paper in an office somewhere. So this digital system alleviates a lot of that. And the main functionality that I built in here is that you pick which Wednesday your client will be able to come in to be seen by this panel. And then this locks you in. These controls are disabled from the user to be able to enter. So the first one is from 9 to 9:15. If the family is going to be there, notice the time jumped up to half an hour. I think we have some changes to this coming down the pipe too, because there's a few other situations where they want it to be half an hour. So this one, they weren't super interested in connecting to the client. So this is just text. Again, all of this is driven by the business use case. The Stearns County Case Manager. So this actually is connected to our users table within Dataverse. Additional attendees, that's just text. What type are they? Initial placement, consultation, different options there. Pick one. What level? And this one you can pick multiple. Reason looks like you can just pick one. And then notes again is open free text. So then I click submit here and notice that these disabled controls bump up to the start being 9:15 and the end being 9:30. If it's a family, goes to 9:45. So I was able to program that logic in there. Again, this is one, if you have this calendar open on this day, somebody could be taking time slots, and luckily this just has not really happened. But this refresh button is to just refresh the list of people that are signed up for that day. I think that's all that's interesting about those. So those are the 3 human services Canvas apps that I have prepared to show. Now I'll move on to what I typically call the back office side, or the model driven app version. So we can start off by looking at on this particular screen here, we have different areas that we can pick. So family and children is where the car seats live. So inside this table here, I have the ID, what type of car seat it is, the expiration, and then there's a power app, or power automate workflow that runs. I can't remember how many months I give them. It might be like 2 or 3 months before the expiration. It will send an email to the admin assistant for this department or this division, letting them know that they need to look into buying a replacement for this car seat after the expiration has passed. Just a little flag as to whether it's available or not, and then the description. So that's the car seats themselves, and then that is connected to relationally to this car seat trackings table. So this is just an auto-generated unique ID for the tracking line item. This is the car seat that's checked out, connected to this car seats table, and then who it's checked out to, which is just the out of the box created by field, when it was checked out, and when the expected return is. So this also gives the flexibility of, let's say somebody dropped off the car seat and they forgot to check it back in. The admin assistant can go into this back office system and enter the date that it was checked back in. And now the app, since the app is pulling from this list, it will show that HSCS 002 is available now. I suppose I can actually prove it, maybe. All right, maybe I spoke too soon. Well, that's the live demo for you. We didn't save it. Well, I'll have to figure out why that doesn't work. So that's the car seat system behind the scenes. The next one that we looked at was interpreter claims. So this is where, again, just a unique tracking ID, when it was created, who the interpreter was, so on and so forth. And so this is the pending claim view. So as the financial workers are doing their, kind of daily work, they'll be looking at this pending claim. And then if they want to just double check the system, they can check this not inactive, unable to be claimed. So this unable to claim, and again, that's based on whatever program and also the duration. So this is a calculated field figuring out how many minutes the interaction was. So these 1 and 2 minute interactions are not eligible. So you can click into each of these individual items and see more fields. We have a few of these that do get pretty complicated, so you can break them up into different tabs, which I did on the Virtual License Center. I'll be able to show you that. Some of the other systems that we do have in here as well are Min Choices referrals, community supports, case manager tracking, quite a few different fields in here that are being tracked, entered by the worker agent, and then in many cases being reviewed by their supervisors. Outreach and housing supports interactions. So these are folks experiencing homelessness, where it was paper and a clipboard as our workers are out in the community meeting with these folks. And you can actually, outside of the model-driven apps, you can also get the Canvas app available on your mobile device as well. So you can enter information directly into this kind of view from your phone. So they're tracking interactions with those folks out in the field. Lots of invoicing things going on here, which we worked with a vendor to build. I think that was Power Objects, who's now called HCL. And the CPST, there's a few tables here. So this is the calendar. So these are all of the Wednesdays. And right now, these are manually entered by the admin assistant. And that's because she needs to come in here and select which team is available, and the room changes anyway. So possibly in a future enhancement would be a Power Automate workflow that would go in and just generate all of these Wednesdays. So then all she would have to do is come in and edit the location and the team. And then the teams are the names of the individuals that sit on those particular committees on any given day. Child maltreatment tracking. This one includes what's called a business process flow. So they have an intake worker who I believe is getting these via phone call. They do some research in a few of the different state systems. And then when they're done filling out their small piece of the pie, then they send it over to who's called the process specialist. And so the business process flow really lets you narrow down the fields based on the type of person that's interacting with this record, so that the process specialist doesn't need to see all of these, or the supervisor doesn't need to see all of these. They only need to see their few fields. Now, you can see them all, but really to do your little bit of it, you only need to see so many. And then this one has a supervisor review at the end. I haven't used this in too many places because you can lay the forms out nicely with different groupings to not really need this, but we did use it in this situation. Crossover youth. So this is a collaboration between our human services department and our attorney's office. And these are young folks that are basically about to go to jail. That's my understanding of the process, is that law enforcement pretty much has them in custody, but rather than put them into jail right away, they want to try to reach out and figure out if this person has a history with the county already or with human services, and then try to get them into a program to reduce their recidivism back into the legal system. So this one, you can see there's different tabs across the top here. I hear somebody had a question. Nope. So these are separated up into different tabs. They have these outcome goals for the individuals, and this whole process again too. There's I think it's a weekly meeting where this group gets together and they review these cases, and then ultimately there's a point person who's a caseworker working with these folks, reaching out to their teachers and community leaders and parents and things like that. They also talk to law enforcement to figure out if they have a criminal background. They enter that in here. Any social services and community corrections work will get entered in here. And these all have their own forms and their own separate fields related to those. Any questions about the human services canvas or model apps? Hopefully this is ringing familiar for some of the other county folks that are here. EBT tracking, min choices referrals, Rule 25s. You're welcome, Pete. Thank you. All right, I'll move on to a few other examples. I'll close these. So this emergency management resource database. So this one was originally a vendor product that we then rebuilt as a from scratch .NET application that talks to a SQL database that's owned by our GIS department. It's kind of a convoluted history there. And essentially what this is, if there's some sort of emergency in the community, tornado comes through, they need dump trucks and bulldozers and things like that. So our emergency management department has relationships with the different companies and organizations in the community that have access to those resources. And so they will keep track of their contact information in here. So this one in particular does have some live information in it. So I'm not going to just completely search here, but I do have a couple test things. So this search up here lets me pick a specific agency to view their information. So if I know who I'm looking for right away, this search down here, you can put in a dump truck, for example, and then you can put the address of the location, and it's going to populate some search results here, showing the distance from where that company is located to the emergency address. And that is done using Bing Maps in this Power App. So I don't think I quite finished that story. So this was a .NET application. It was our only .NET application. And then the primary developer that was working on that ended up leaving the county. And I have worked with .NET applications in the past, but it was not something I did very frequently. So every time we had to come back and do some sort of update to this application, it was, okay, let me relearn how Visual Studio works with this .NET MVC application. And that really wasn't so bad. It was more of the, what is the deployment pipeline look like for this? And do I, it may be different devices since I had to update it last. So since we weren't doing any other .NET development, it didn't seem to make sense to have the one. And then every time we had to update it, kind of refamiliarize with that technology. Meanwhile, Power Apps, we're using increasingly more frequently. So I kind of just challenged myself and I said, well, I wonder how long it would take me to rebuild this .NET application in Power Apps. And it turned out, I think it was about 8 hours or less to just get the kind of skeleton of it done. And then it was kind of just nuance, moving things around. But essentially, if I pick an agency or I do the search and then I click on the agency name, I'll click go to agency. The default screen it puts you on is contacts list. So these are all the contacts, and this whole application is talking to an SQL database, SQL Server, and I think it's probably 5 or 6 different tables that have been heavily normalized. So there's a lot of translation between what is in the database and then what I'm displaying on the screen here. But there's a lot of different relational connections. So I can see their different locations. Pretty much everything has notes on it. They needed the ability, depending who is logged in, they may or may not see this pencil up here, and that gives them all the ability to edit, delete these things. Then when you're building a Power App and you put in the line of code that says delete this item, it just goes ahead and deletes it right away. So you do have to build in your own safeguards. So this trash can icon actually just controls whether this checkbox and this X show up or not. This doesn't actually do any deleting. So to actually delete it, I need to click this checkbox. And that functionality is kind of throughout. I was consistent with that. And then again, you notice that this is all very manual configuration that's done, but it's very little code involved with hiding and showing these things. So notes I talked about, resources. Don't ask me where I get my my test concepts from. I must have been hungry for potatoes, and maybe one of my dogs was bugging me when I did this one in particular. Contacts, that's the default one. And then this annex, they have a bunch of different categories that they use to categorize these things. I don't know why it's called annex, but that's their terminology. They're the ones using this application. So that's the EMRD, which was a .NET application and now is a Power App that talks to SQL Server. The next one, this was one that I made because we were in the middle of remodeling and expanding one of our office locations. And so the IT team was going to be moving out to this new location. And as a project manager, a lot of what I do is have meetings with folks. And this was pre-COVID days. So I was trying to figure out, if I have a meeting, where should I have it? Should I have it at the service center, or should I have it downtown in our admin building? And the way that I figured would be the most fair to figure out where to host the meeting and who to make drive would be to see where people were. So if it was, and this connects to our, I think it's not directly to Azure AD, but it goes to the Office 365 profiles where we have office location in there. And so as people are creating a meeting, I think I closed my Outlook. Stop sharing for a second. As you're making a new meeting invite, not a new email. Share my screen again. So as you're making a new meeting invite, you can do what? You type in people's names, and then let's say you have 20 people in there. You can just copy them and paste it in here. Click the search, and now we see that Matt's location is marked as the admin center and Martin is at the service center. But I was able to account for this Outlook format because I knew what Outlook's format always is when you copy and paste. The other option is you can search for people individually and then see where their work location is. So that this one we didn't end up putting into production with everybody starting to work remotely and the increased use of Teams. Didn't really make sense, but maybe at some point it will get used. Another one, this was an interesting use case when COVID happened. Our one of our main parks, Quarry Park, had to keep track and limit the number of people that were in the park. Well, the only way to really do that was to keep it to the number of parking spaces they had. So the gate attendant who was selling the parking passes, they would keep track of people coming in and coming out. And they had like an Excel spreadsheet going, or it was written down on paper, and it was kind of all over the place. And they didn't have, the gatekeepers were using their, I think, personal cell phones to text to the customers to let them know that there was a parking space open so that they could come back. So this Power Apps, this data is written back to Dataverse tables with a model-driven app that the parks admin can have access to. But it also connects to a service called Twilio, which I'm sure at least some of you are familiar with, but it's a texting service. And it was very easy to use the Twilio connectors for this Power App to send out text messages. And it's very cheap. It's like 5 cents or less, I think, for an outgoing text message. You can, through the Twilio service, receive text messages back as well. We didn't need to do that for this use case. And that is where you also need a server set up with webhooks to accept and handle the response that's coming back. But luckily, we were just sending messages out. So someone would drive up. They would say, here's my phone number. Add me to the list. People would call in and ask, well, how long is the wait? So I put some just quick data cards at the top here so that the gate attendant could say, well, there's 2 people in queue. The average wait, so that takes, I think, everybody that has gone in that day, how long did they have to wait from when they got added to the list from when they finally got parked in there. And then the last wait is the last person. So let's say, the park filled up and then it was half an hour before somebody left. You never know how long it will take for a spot to open up. So between the average wait and then the last wait, they can kind of give a rough estimate for folks calling in or driving through and asking when they might be able to get in. So these are obviously made up phone numbers, but this envelope here, click that, notify this number. And again, this is all you have to program it. I had to create this window that pops up, and I had to place these buttons here, and I had to sort of write the logic to show and hide this as you click that button. But if I click confirm here, it's going to activate Twilio that will send the text message. When the person actually shows up and they're ready to park, I can click this checkbox and confirm that they're checked in. If they call back or just don't show after a period of time, you'll click this X and then remove them from the list. And then I mean they would get a 100-person wait list, so I just added a search box there. So they could search. That's a Quarry parking wait list. Then I also want to jump in now to our newest virtual license center. So this was ultimately built and configured by Power Objects, now known as HCL. Although I think they still kind of go by Power Objects a little bit. So this is a Power Apps portal, and this allows external customers to log in, authenticate. So this was me logging in with my Gmail account, and then they're able to fill out these various applications. So if I want to purchase a motorcycle manual for $5, I go in here, put in my contact information, go to pricing to pay. I just want one, save and continue. Next steps, submit. And now this is a little bit of custom functionality that Power Objects had to build for us, is this shopping cart concept. So I have all of these items in here, but I want to check out now. So all of these are marked as draft, so I can't pay for them, but this one is marked as in progress. So I should be able to check out for that one. It's only picking up the motorcycle manual because that's the only one that's ready to go. I'm picking my shipping and checkout options. And then there's custom functionality in here so that once I confirm my information here, I click to make a payment and it takes me now to the US Bank portal. So this is not actually our portal. This is US Bank's e-payment portal that you complete the transaction. Now, the part that Power Objects had to do a little bit of finagling is there was not a good way for the e-payment portal to send any sort of confirmation back to the portal, to our portal, that the customer had paid. But what does happen is when a customer pays, they get emailed a receipt from US Bank. So we actually have US Bank blind carbon copying an email account at the county with that receipt. And then we have a few Power Automate workflows that handle, they check those emails as they come in, and then they mark them in the back office system. So the portal that I was just on is actually our production portal. So I won't be able, then this is the sandbox. So I won't be able to see that exact transaction that we did. But here are some just examples. CDL manual, very similar to what we had just done. So there's a summary page, contact information, back office of, was payment successful? And you notice that from the back office side, this is locked because it's all kind of handled by the workflows and by the portal. Applicant details, so that's the customer. Some of the applications require supporting documents to be uploaded. This is the particular item that was purchased in the application. The only one on this page is the quantity for that. Is there a more complicated one? No. Free park permit. No, just still a number in there as well. So all of this information comes from the portal and then goes back into this back office system where the license center workers can, actually print out the license or stick the quarry parking permit in an envelope and then physically mail it out. Purchase groups, this is the custom table that was created by Power Objects to be the shopping cart concept, and this kind of ties everything together. So a purchase group can consist of multiple applications. And then finally, the receipts to track payments that were actually made. And then, of course, contacts. And then this uses Azure Active Directory, business to consumer, B2C. So you create a whole separate Active Directory organization that's specific to your external portals. And you can use the same one across multiple portals. But then folks can sign up with, their Gmail account and or whatever email account they want to use, and that profile will, or at least the login information will carry over across whatever portals we happen to have. I also pulled up, so this is kind of the old version of the Power Apps portal. This is ADX Studios, but it looks very similar. This actually connects to our on-prem Microsoft Dynamics environment. So whether you're in Dataverse or Dynamics Online, you can do the same stuff. If you have Dynamics on-prem with ADX Studios, you can do the same thing. Same type of deal, just looks a little bit different. So we have Homestead out here. The first one that we had was septic permit for installers. so on and so forth. All right, I see we have 6 minutes left. Is that right?
Yeah, you certainly, if you have more to cover, that's totally fine.
I think I'll jump into a little bit of Power Automate because I haven't shown that at all. And one of our kind of most used Power Automate use cases is for PTO requests. And I think I will pick, they're mostly the same. So this is Power Automate, very similar to Power Apps. It runs off of data connections. So it could be a data connection to SharePoint, could be a data connection to Dynamics, could be a data connection to the Office 365 users. Kind of like your My Profile type of information. So this workflow in particular talks to a SharePoint calendar that we just recently migrated from SharePoint 2013 on-prem to SharePoint Online. And notice the trigger here is whenever an item is created or modified in this site, this list, then do all of this stuff, which this can very quickly get overwhelming. This particular piece here, all this does is try to catch and prevent infinite loops, which we do have access to do some prevention of that in the settings here under trigger conditions, but we're still a little bit new to this and I don't completely trust it yet. All of these purple actions here are initializing variables that I'll use later. If anybody's done any sort of programming against SharePoint, you'll know that the times are screwy. So when you go and create an item in SharePoint and you select a time for something, it will be as it's displayed there in Central Time or wherever you happen to be. But on the server, it's actually handled as GMT time, which I think is we're -5 or -6 from GMT depending on the time of year, but I have to do some formatting of the time, which is a big pain to do, but once you get used to it and you expect it, it's not so bad. So that's pretty much what this is doing. Our old PTO workflow would automatically add approved items to people's calendars using Nintex. Power Automate cannot do that. So right now, the version that we have creates an ICS file, and you can include information from like this variable is coming from directly from SharePoint. These are my calculated times. Then we're uploading that ICS file to OneDrive, just to a temp folder. Kind of strange, but then you have to get that file. And then it will be used later on when we're sending emails around. Each of our PTO situations have a call-in checkbox. So that's if a supervisor or someone else is entering your PTO item for you. They can mark it as a check-in, and then it will automatically get approved and send the notification, which this should include so here's the attachment of the ICS file. So they'll get this email that says it was approved, and then they can double click that ICS file and it will get added to their personal Outlook calendar. You have to do a little bit of HTML inside these emails to get them to look nice. But again, you can include all of these data points from either SharePoint or any variables that you have created as well. And then terminate just ends the workflow there, so it doesn't need to proceed through the rest. We have had the use case where we need to have a covering supervisor for folks. If your supervisor is going to be out for 2 weeks, but you need to take off next week, but you didn't know until the last minute, you can enter in whoever is your covering supervisor in that SharePoint form. Otherwise, it will use the person that Active Directory says is your supervisor to send the approval to. This is new functionality, but getting existing approved items from SharePoint. So like human services, they're mandated to have 50% coverage in any of their particular units. So rather than having the supervisor get the request on their phone, somebody muted me. Looks like I've got 1 minute left. So I'll just kind of quickly glance through these. Ultimately, it ends up in creating this approval, which this is Microsoft's out-of-the-box approval system, which you'll notice they have a navigation item for here in Power Automate. Sends the email to the person approving it. Once the approver sends in their response, the workflow picks it back up, handles their response, and then updates the SharePoint item with whether it was either approved or rejected, and then notifies the requestor. And then very, very finally, it will delete the ICS file because after it gets attached to the email, it doesn't need to live out in OneDrive anymore. So these are our use cases at Stearns County for Power Apps, Power Automate, Dynamics, Dataverse, and all of that jazz. Thanks for your time and your interest, and I'm always more than happy to talk to folks about pretty much any of this stuff. I also want to put a pitch out there for any other county users that are attending this. The fourth Thursday of every month, the Minnesota Counties Computer Cooperative, MN365, has a Microsoft 365 user group that I'm a co-chair of. So we meet fourth Thursday of every month, and you can sign up for that at mn365.org on the RSVP calendar.
Awesome, Dylan. Can you make sure you put the link in the chat for everyone who's working at county?
All right, thanks for your time and attention.
Awesome. Thank you for such a wide variety of